Whoa, watch your step there, soldier. What was that sound? Was that the click of a pressure plate underfoot or the snag of a tripwire? Hold still. Stay calm and breathe slowly if you want to make it out alive. Across the history of warfare, human beings have come up with plenty of inventive ways to kill each other, including methods that don't even require another person to carry out the deed. From hidden bombs activated by unsuspecting passersby, to punji sticks, pits full of snakes, to sabotaged ammunition. These are some of the most insane booby traps ever deployed in war. Starting out with one of the most familiar and frighteningly widely used human rights violation devices, booby traps, is none other than the humble landmine. It's also the first of many of the traps on this list that are designed to blow up enemy combatants without the need for a soldier to manually trigger a detonator. Turns out, a lot of booby traps revolve around explosions, and that makes a degree of sense, right? If the goal is to kill someone from the safety of several miles away, then something that makes a nice big blast is more likely to get the job done. Typically, landmines are buried beneath the ground, but not too deep. We're only talking just below the surface level. After all, too much dirt between them and their targets isn't going to make for a very effective trap now, is it? Upon hearing the mention of the word landmines, most will immediately picture the same thing: a circular, encased explosive charge that's either detonated by the weight of a footfall on a pressure pad or put on a timer to explode after a set delay. Say if you were to bury a few in an area that you knew an enemy convoy will be passing through in an hour's time, for example. But one of the earliest precursors to landmines as we know them actually came into use during World War I, when German troops buried extra artillery shells in the ground to catch unsuspecting British and French forces by surprise. Since their increased usage during the Second World War, landmines have undergone a few variations, with many swapping out their metal casing for plastic ones, so they're a little harder to detect by those tasked with sweeping minefields. The main use of landmines is to disrupt larger attacks by infantry or tanks, and there exists two different basic types for each: anti-tank mines designed to destroy vehicles, and anti-personnel mines which explode into small fragments to kill or wound soldiers. However, the big problem with landmines is they can't tell who's stepping on them, and there's no way of distinguishing between civilians and soldiers. Given that mines are designed to be exploded by proximity or direct contact with a person, and the sheer number of them that are left unexploded and discarded on former battlefields, landmines are still able to pose a threat to innocent lives. As such, in May of 1996, over 120 countries signed a treaty to ban the manufacture and use of anti-personnel landmines, destroy their own stockpiles, and help clear any minefields within their own borders. The only countries that didn't sign were Russia, China, and the good old United States of America. Way before soldiers started using mines on land, though, the naval forces of the world had been using a similar tactic at sea for about 100 years before landmines started to be developed and deployed. Submarine mines, or sea mines, were similar in concept to landmines, with the main differences being their overall designs and the fact that they were in use as early as the mid-19th century. The most common type of sea mine contained about 500 pounds of explosives within a steel sphere. These would be left in the water by specialized ships, known as minesweepers, or dropped from aircraft. Defensively, they were left in locations surrounding important harbors or other military installations, or placed in areas of the water where enemy vessels were expected to pass. The mine's spherical shape enabled them to float, given that they would contain enough air so that they wouldn't just sink down to the seabed once the mine was anchored in place. In order to detonate a sea mine, well, just ask that poor guy from Hot Fuzz who found out pretty intimately how they work. The most common mechanism was a contact rod, which are protruding spikes or antennae poking out from a sphere casing. When they're struck by a passing ship, these rods activate a firing mechanism within the mine, causing a detonation, and one hell of a splash. However, water on deck will be the least of your worries when your hull has a massive hole in it. Throughout the Second World War, the Axis powers and the Allied forces laid more than 550,000 mines at sea, with the Allies alone losing 1,118 of their vessels to sea mine explosions. The Nazis and other Axis powers lost almost 200 more, with a total of 1,316 ships destroyed by sea mines. Of course, finding an explosive in a place you'd perhaps expect, like a minefield either at sea or on land, is one thing. It's another all the more surprising thing to stumble across one somewhere you never see coming, like inside something that's already dead. There's long been a popular urban legend that soldiers during World War I and II, on both sides of the conflicts, would rig the bodies of their fallen comrades with explosives, set to explode when the enemy forces entered an area. While there's no evidence that this was a widespread, commonly used tactic in either World War, in the early 2000s, insurgent groups in the Middle East developed their own variation on this idea to spring explosive booby traps on US and UK troops in Iraq, the roadkill bomb. You see, the key trick with leaving any kind of booby trap somewhere is that you don't really want the intended target to spot it until it's already too late. But when it comes to bombs, there are some ways to make your trip seem a little more conspicuous. For example, a discarded parcel or an old oil drum left on the side of the road is more likely to get reported as suspicious. So insurgents in Iraq looked for a solution, something that was less likely to be noticed, and nobody would think to approach it automatically with caution. And frankly, nobody expects something already dead to pose any kind of a threat. They took to using the carcasses of dead animals to conceal radioactivated explosive devices, either hiding C4 plastic explosives or homemade bombs loaded with nails or ball bearings, to cause as many casualties as possible when the blast sent these small metal pieces scattering in all directions. While these roadkill bombs were rare, as many as 50 attacks like this took place in the Iraqi city of Basra back in 2004, with the primary target the British forces in the area at the time. Hiding a booby trap in an unassuming animal carcass? Sure, that's all well and good. Your target needs to actually stumble upon the rigged roadkill, and you've got to be within radio signal to detonate. What's even better? Hiding a booby trap in something that's not only familiar, but also that your enemy can't live without. Their Zippo lighter. Take a look at any photograph of the United States forces during the Vietnam War, and one thing will be abundantly clear: the American GIs loved to smoke. There was even a rumored piece of anti-war propaganda that claimed troops in Vietnam weren't just using their lighters for sparking up the end of a cigarette either, but they'd used them to set fire to thatched roofs, burning down villages during search and destroy missions. While that is still disputed, it does fall in line with the Viet Cong sneaking Zippo lighter bombs into the United States bases. Or maybe they too just noticed that the US troops couldn't seem to go 5 minutes without a cigarette. Whatever the impetus behind them, these sneaky Zippo bombs were packed with enough explosives to take off a soldier's hand. What's even worse is they had no way of telling a real lighter from one of those explosive fakes, meaning a GI hoping for a relaxing smoke could be in for some much more immediate bodily damage than the usual tar in the lungs. But speaking of the Viet Cong, they're still remembered as almost being the front-runners when it comes to deploying booby traps in warfare. In fact, when you Google search for insane booby traps used in war, you tend to find a majority of sources only talking about the Vietnam War. You see, while they weren't able to match the United States' military weapons or sheer force of numbers, what they were able to do was utilize guerrilla warfare tactics to both harm and hinder US troops. Where some of the American forces were underprepared for battle in the hot conditions of the jungle, the Viet Cong's knowledge of their environment as well as their determination and tenacity proved to make them a formidable force against the invading US. And one way they were able to utilize their surroundings against the United States was through booby traps. A lot of their traps were not only cheap and easy to make, but they had the added bonus of being both devastating and hard to detect, since a lot of them didn't rely on mechanical components. A lot of them were simple enough to work on their own, meaning the Viet Cong could set them well ahead of time, then just leave them concealed with leaves for an unsuspecting GI to stumble across. Even worse, a lot of their traps were designed to maim, not to kill, allowing them to serve as a psychological weapon too. American soldiers caught in them were left harrowed, as were their comrades who had to free them. Arguably, the most infamous of the Viet Cong's booby trap arsenal was the punji sticks. They were typically sticks of bamboo, sharpened to form a spike at one end. These were designed to impale a victim and were also often coated with poison from local plants or smeared in, well, let's just say things you wouldn't want to get in an open wound for risk of a serious infection. Punji sticks were often left in deep pits that were dug in areas that US troops were likely to be passing through, and upon falling in, soldiers would get impaled on the spikes below. In fact, these traps accounted for almost 2% of the wounds inflicted on US soldiers during the Vietnam War. But remember, the point of a lot of these traps wasn't to kill, but to injure troops and slow their units down while trying to assist their impaled colleagues. Some punji stick pits had additional spikes around the edges of the pit walls, pointing inwards, making it harder for soldiers to climb out without causing further harm to themselves. The Viet Cong would also often dig pits close together, meaning that the troops coming to aid a comrade who had fallen could likely end up suffering the same fate in a neighboring pit. Punji sticks were also occasionally used in preparation for ambushes, with Viet Cong digging these spike-filled pits in spots where American soldiers were likely to take cover, only to fall and impale themselves on the sharpened bamboo below. Punji sticks weren't the only concealed dangers the Viet Cong left for particularly unlucky Americans. For U.S. forces, watching where they stepped was imperative. The wrong footing could land someone not just impaled on bamboo spikes, but also see them and their squadmates blown to smithereens. Grenade traps were hidden tripwires that were connected to hand grenades. Now, you may be thinking, well, that's not a very good booby trap. Grenades need someone to pull the pins in order to prime them. And that's a good point. And these traps worked by getting the unsuspecting soldiers to pull those pins themselves. How? The Viet Cong would attach one end of a string to a stake stuck in the ground, then the other to the pin of a grenade, causing the pin to be pulled when the soldier's foot caught the tripwire. Alternatively, the Viet Cong would pull the pins on the grenades themselves and keep the safety lever down to stop them from exploding. They'd very carefully put these primed ready-to-blow grenades inside tin cans, which were then fastened to trees and kept low to the ground. A tripwire was still part of the grenade traps like these, except in this version, it would pull these live grenades out of the cans containing them, allowing the safety lever to release and igniting the firing mechanism. Cartridge traps, also known as toe poppers, were also widely used by the Viet Cong, and these were as equally ingenious as they were diabolical. They placed the bullets, or the cartridges in military lingo, from smaller arms like pistols within small tubes of bamboo. Sounds pretty counterintuitive, right? Wouldn't the cartridges go in a gun? Or in a magazine that's fed into a weapon? Yes, we see you gun owners in the comments. Sure, if you're an American soldier fighting in a highly protested and unjust war, which one, am I right? Then you're going to be expecting to be shot at, with bullets zipping toward you, but are you really going to be planning for one to be firing off from right under you? That's the purpose of cartridge traps. Bullets in bamboo tubes were placed over a nail and then camouflaged with surrounding foliage, the tip protruding upwards. This was so that when a U.S. soldier stepped on it, the pressure pushed on the bullet inside, forcing it down onto the nail, which would ignite its primer and cause it to explode. Want to know the grim reason these were nicknamed toe poppers? These traps were again designed to maim so that the Viet Cong could launch an ambush when whoever was wounded was being treated for an injury. Cartridge traps could easily take off entire toes when stepped on, and while they were only meant to wound soldiers, the size of the shell could also make them fatal. As if spikes in pits, tripwires attached to grenades, and foot-destroying bullets weren't enough to watch out for in the jungles of Vietnam, how about the local wildlife unknowingly joining in the fight against the U.S.? Imagine you're a U.S. soldier navigating one of the Viet Cong's numerous tunnel systems that they use to conduct ambushes on the American forces. Suddenly, you pass what looks like a beam of bamboo, thinking it's just some kind of support keeping the tunnel's integrity together. Then, your heart jumps in your chest as you accidentally knock it with your leg and it tumbles over. But instead of bringing the tunnel down on top of you, a very irate, deadly bamboo pit viper comes slithering out, and you're the unlucky one who freed it. That's right, in something that sounds like it was taken straight out of Indiana Jones's nightmares, the Viet Cong weren't above using venomous snakes in booby traps against American troops. United States soldiers tasked with clearing out underground tunnels were nicknamed tunnel rats, given how often they were the prey of bamboo pit vipers. These snakes possess a venomous bite. While it might not have been high in toxicity, it was certainly something troops would have preferred not to have. A pit viper could quickly turn aggressive and not hesitate to bite someone when threatened. Their venom is both hemotoxic and neurotoxic, often causing severe pain and swelling of an entire affected limb, as well as nausea and vomiting. Another Viet Cong booby trap involved sneaking these snakes into their packs in the hopes that they'd bite any U.S. soldier that searched them. Leaving these kinds of traps out in the open is all part of the guerrilla style of warfare that the Viet Cong is remembered for. But just like with the Zippo lighter bombs, it's an added level of ingenuity to leave booby traps somewhere a U.S. soldier is bound to stumble onto it and where they'd least expect it. Enter the explosive flags, another way the Viet Cong booby-trapped their own belongings to get the better of any Americans that either captured or killed them or their bases. What was so ingenious about this booby trap was the psychology behind it. How it utilized the US troops' blind patriotism against them. US troops loved capturing flags, so if the Viet Cong were ever forced to abandon a location, they'd do so with the knowledge that their enemy would likely tear down, confiscate, or attempt to destroy any Vietnamese flag that was still left flying. So, predicting how the Americans would act, they rigged their own Vietnamese flags, along with anything else the US forces might decide to steal, as a war trophy, with concealed grenades. These would then detonate when anyone attempted to lower the flag or move the pole to which it was affixed. The North Vietnamese Army, who the Viet Cong guerrillas were supporting, also used booby traps like this, referring to them as keepsake lose hand traps. Arguably, the worst booby trap to be caught in during the Vietnam War was simply called the mace, and that name alone paints a pretty painful picture of what it entails. Named after the medieval bludgeoning weapon, this particular mace was a 24-inch wide metal or wooden ball weighing around 40 pounds, with several large spikes protruding from it. Upon snagging the tripwire, an unlucky US soldier would find this ball of death swinging down from the trees above them, likely smashing multiple bones from the sheer force of impact alone, as well as wounding or outright killing them with its stabbing spikes. Similar to the mace were the tiger traps, but unlike the name suggests, these didn't involve unleashing big cats on US troops. Instead, tiger traps consisted of boards roughly the size of a grown man, weighted with bricks, studded with spikes and barbed wire. Once a tripwire was activated, it would release a catch on a rope and cause the tiger trap to release, impaling whoever was below. Another in the Viet Cong's laundry list of creative solutions to clearing out pests, in this case American soldiers, was the bamboo whip. This one also used bamboo, which is famously pretty flexible as far as wood goes. So the Viet Cong would lash sharpened spikes to a long bamboo pole, pull it back into an arc, then tie it to another tree and rig it with a catch in a tripwire. The moment the American soldier caught the wire, the flexible bamboo would whip out toward them, impaling their chest with several sharp wooden spikes. It is certainly no exaggeration to say that the Viet Cong had the advantage over the US when it came to booby traps. Look at how many examples we were able to get from just them alone. But of course, never one to be outdone, the Americans did have a kind of booby trap of their own that they intended to use to get one over on their Vietnamese adversaries. Referred to as Project Eldest Son, this covert operation revolved around sabotaging Viet Cong ammunition, making it deadly to those firing it, as opposed to the US troops being fired upon. Carried out by the United States Studies and Operation Group, or SOG, for those of you who grew up playing Call of Duty Black Ops, the goal of Eldest Son was to intercept ammo supply lines that were delivering ordnances to communist combat forces throughout Southeast Asia, not just in Vietnam but also in Laos and Cambodia. Technicians working for the SOG assembled over 11,500 cartridges for AK-47 assault rifles, as well as nearly 560 heavy machine gun cartridges and close to 2,000 Type 67 mortar shells. But what did they do with all this excess ammo? Oh, they gave it to the US enemies, of course. But these weren't your typical standard-issue rounds of ammunition. These were all decoys that had been specifically designed to blow up right in the enemy's face. No, literally. The rounds were dispersed at random into cartridges used by America's enemies, usually during patrols by US Special Forces. Guerrilla fighters would then unknowingly allow these sabotaged rounds to be scattered into their ammo supplies, like how loose change gets mixed up and passed around from person to person. Except you're not expecting a quarter you got from a gas station to suddenly detonate. Then again, maybe you live in Florida. These fake rounds were filled with powdered explosives, which to the untrained eye seemed no different from ordinary gunpowder. If someone was unlucky enough to fire one of these booby-trapped bullets, it would either jam their weapon or worse, cause it to explode, lodging metal fragments from their destroyed gun throughout their body. Ouch! And who says that guns don't kill people? Under Project Eldest Son, US Special Forces also similarly booby-trapped enemy artillery rounds, replacing the fuses inside of mortar shells with broken ones that would detonate while the round was still inside the mortar chamber itself. The explosion that came as a result was often powerful enough to not only destroy the mortar and any additional ammunition stored nearby, but also the crew operating it as well. The idea behind Project Eldest Son wasn't a new one, however. Booby-trapping bullets had been around for a while. The Second World War saw the earliest deployment of what was known as explosively formed penetrators. Hey, stop giggling. EFPs are small-shaped charges designed to pierce armor from a much longer range than a lot of standard explosive charges. What makes EFPs fall into the category of booby traps is primarily that they're relatively easy to make. In fact, they're still widely used by some terrorist groups today. Simple EFPs consist of little more than a metal plate and a container housing heavy-duty explosives. Once they've been detonated, it's not just the blast that deals a great deal of damage, but also the metal plate itself, which becomes a deadly projectile that can travel at speeds of well over 4,000 miles per hour, tearing through a vehicle's outer defenses. We've seen some insanely inventive ways that booby traps have been deployed, primarily for offensive means, to ambush, injure, or outright kill enemy combatants. But what about setting them up as a means of defense? Better yet, what if somebody used booby traps to protect an exalted commander long after they were already dead? Well, welcome to the tomb of the first emperor of unified China, Qin Shi Huang. This ancient ruler was so determined to be remembered that he had a huge necropolis built to honor his passing. His tomb was guarded by thousands of soldiers. Well, these warriors might not be flesh and blood, but terracotta troops that are partly responsible for keeping archaeologists from reaching their emperor's remains over 2,000 years after his rule. The other reason is because of all the booby traps. Come on now, a tomb full of terracotta warriors and booby traps? What is this, the underwhelming sequel to The Mummy? Actually, Qin Shi Huang and his booby-trapped final resting place was part of the inspiration behind the third Mummy movie, Tomb of the Dragon Emperor. But rather than having a giant stone boulder roll after unwary interlopers, the real-world tomb is said to contain a plethora of deadly hidden traps that have actively impeded archaeologists from properly exploring it. But surely the mechanisms made to defend a tomb made thousands of years ago would have eroded and rotted away after that much time, right? Wrong. Since Qin Shi Huang's tomb was discovered back in the mid-70s, it's garnered infamy owing not just to the army of terracotta warriors, but also the numerous writings claiming the entire place is rigged with hidden crossbows and 100 rivers made of mercury. While this might all seem like tall tales and sensationalism, scientists have discovered that there are 100 times the expected levels of mercury within the air and soil in the reachable parts of the tomb. And when inhaled, mercury can cause permanent lung damage as well as potential brain damage. Additionally, the weapons of some of the ornamental terracotta warriors have also been tested, and the findings that these tests yielded do lend some credence to the rumors of hidden crossbows firing arrows at wayward archaeologists who got too far into the tomb. The soldiers' ornate weaponry was said to be coated in chromate, which preserved the metal, protecting it from rusting away after so many years. If these supposed crossbows were also treated with chromate, then some of them could very easily still be operational. And how's this for an added piece of evidence? While it could have been deemed unsafe for some other reason, the Chinese government did, for a time, impose a now-lifted ban on further exploration of Qin Shi Huang's tomb. Even now that the ban has been revoked, many are still reluctant to enter, and any future exploration of the potentially booby-trapped necropolis is on indefinite standby. Still, Qin Shi Huang would not be the only person in history to go to extreme lengths to protect his body. In the 18th and 19th centuries, grave robbers were snatching up the dearly departed, often selling their remains to doctors who used these bodies for surgical practice in the days before donating your body to science was an option. So some graveyards started implementing a security system in the war against grave robbery. Cemetery guns, possibly one of the most American solutions to a problem ever. While you might assume that these were fired when a criminal tripped a pressure-sensitive trigger, the value of human life wasn't exactly at an all-time high during the 18th century. Oh, how times have changed. Cemetery guns were installed at night, so grave robbers wouldn't know which graves had been booby-trapped. Each one was fired via tripwire, which also swiveled the cemetery gun in the direction of the person who tripped it. Unfortunately, this meant that these early technically autonomous turrets wouldn't discriminate between a corpse-thieving criminal, a passing animal, or an innocent grieving relative of the recently deceased. Still, at least they'd be quickly reunited with their lost family members in a flash. The Viet Cong, overzealous emperors, and cemetery owners are far from the only ones to deploy some insane and inventive booby traps. The Nazis also had a few up their sleeves during the latter years of the Second World War. Driven by their desperation at an impending loss of the war, with supplies dwindling and constant defeats at the hands of the Allied forces, some Nazi engineers came up with ways to hit back at the Allies by hiding bombs pretty much anywhere they could. Rifles and helmets left discarded on battlefields were rigged to blow, as were the doors and windows of abandoned buildings in towns that the Nazi troops had previously occupied. Sure, if they were being driven out, they could at least take out a few of the Allied troops moving in and drive down their morale as a result. In an attempt to wound the Allied leadership, the Nazis came up with a strategy that revolved around sneaking booby traps into whatever the largest, least damaged building was in an area that they were evacuating from. They thought that anywhere still structurally sound enough would be an ideal spot for the Allies to set up a command post to conduct their continued advance, and a building like that would likely be where the higher-ranking personnel would be stationed. So the crooked picture bomb came into the picture. Sorry, we couldn't resist. Most of the traps the Nazis left behind would get discovered by Allied troops, either cleared safely or found the other way while exploring an abandoned building. The crooked picture bomb was designed to be missed during the soldiers' initial sweep and only detonated after the Allies had already established a headquarters in the building. Bombs were planted in hollowed-out walls and concealed behind a framed photograph or a painting. But here's the key element in how the Nazis intended to specifically target the top brass of their enemies. They leave the picture hanging slightly askew. The assumption was that an ordinary, common soldier wouldn't notice or think anything of it, but a pompous, pampered officer who'd spent most of the war out of harm's way would think to correct the error and straighten up the wonky picture. But little would they note that this simple act of feng shui would prove deadly. The bombs hidden behind those crooked pictures were rigged to blow the moment the frame covering them was moved, killing everyone in the room. It turned out the Nazis knew their enemies. This tactic worked, taking out a handful of Allied officers before the end of the war. And as far-fetched as it might seem, the Nazis also stashed, bombs in even more unsuspecting places. Imagine opening up a bar of chocolate only for it to detonate. That's so ridiculous we don't even need to write a joke for it. But yes, Nazi spies had planned to conceal steel and an explosive canvas under a thin layer of chocolate so that an unassuming bar would blow the moment it was broken. However, the closest they ever got to deploying these food-based bombs was in 1940, when 3 Nazi spies on the southern coast of Ireland attempted to sneak 4 explosive cans of peas into Buckingham Palace. But in a spectacular blunder, one of the spies asked a random Irish citizen to direct him to the IRA, the Irish Republican Army. Naturally, the civilians instead turned them over to the police, and all the explosive chocolate bars and cans of peas in the world would do little to deter the Nazis' inevitable defeat in 1945. Speaking of the IRA, though, they were partial to using booby traps of their own during the Troubles. Both the Provisional Irish Republican Army, the IRA, and the Irish National Liberation Army, the INLA, would often attempt to kill soldiers from the British Army by attaching bombs to vehicles so that when someone started driving, it would cause the explosive to detonate. Around 180 of the deaths caused during the Troubles were the result of booby traps like this, with a majority of them laid by the Provisional IRA. Improvised explosive devices, or IEDs, are still widely used by non-military combatants, like guerrillas and insurgents, as crude but highly effective weapons against a more conventional military. They can be constructed either using military-issue components or relatively cheap everyday ingredients, making them a modern weapon of choice for a number of terror cells. And no, we're not going to tell you what household items you can use to make IEDs. We don't want another video drawing the ire of the FBI. Besides, you've all seen Fight Club. Entrances to various buildings have been booby-trapped to using IEDs to kill or injure anyone who sets foot inside, while vehicle-based IEDs have been used to target military installations. For example, in 1983, vehicle-borne IEDs were deployed in Beirut during attacks on the barracks of French paratroopers and United States Marines. Both the Iraq and Afghanistan wars saw widespread use of improvised explosive devices among insurgent fighters. Even today, the war in Ukraine has seen thousands of explosives, including mines and other booby traps, left scattered across the country by Russian forces. Some have just been discarded by troops, others have been intentionally left to kill any passers-by, whether they're military or civilians. It's been predicted the cleanup effort to fully dispose of these booby traps will take years. History certainly doesn't repeat itself, but it often does seem to rhyme. Now check out most insane booby traps used during the Vietnam War, or watch this video instead.